One of my favorite passages in scripture is in the book of Numbers that deals with the cloud that covered the tabernacle. So let me just give you a little background, then I'll read the passage to you, and then we'll make a couple of comments about it. But anyway, we understand that Moses had led the children of Israel out of Egypt through the power of God, even though we say Moses, but it's through the power of God, and with great signs and wonders of deliverance. He broke the power of the Egyptians and all of their idol gods, which that's basically, for the most part, what all of the signs and wonders were all about. When God performed those particular miracles, it was to show that there is just one God, Yahweh. To answer the question, okay, do you mind if I digress just a little bit, guys? It was to show that there's just one true God, Yahweh. He is the God of the Hebrews, and that all of these gods of the Egyptians were no gods at all. So therefore, when we would see the different plagues that would strike Egypt, it was supposed to be against the protecting hands of the idol gods of Egypt. Thus, God would demonstrate himself to be greater than the gods of Egypt. Remember, it kind of all boils down to when Moses initially came to Pharaoh and he said, "Thus saith the Lord." Now, that's how we read it in English, but in our Hebrew text, it is the proper name of God that is being used when Moses goes to address Pharaoh with the command to let the people go. So he says, "Thus says Yahweh, let my people go." And that's why Pharaoh responded back to Moses, "And who is Yahweh that I should obey him and let the Israelites go?" And thus we see, in a sense of a competition, but as I was just simply saying, we see the hand of God proving and showing just who he is, that Yahweh, the God of these poor, broken down Israelites, Yahweh alone is God, and God demonstrated his power over any other gods by destroying the gods of the Egyptians, which we understand again are idols and no gods at all. And you have to remember, it was during this time that Egypt was the most powerful nation on the face of the earth at that time. And also, too, Egypt attributed her power, her wealth, her dominance in all of these things to her gods, to her idol gods. Even Pharaoh himself was considered to be the son of Ra, a god in human form. But anyway, but back to the point. So God delivered them, and it was in that deliverance, as God was bringing them out of Egypt, that he began to lead them in a cloud. And in this cloud that he led them, this cloud that protected them even from the armies of Pharaoh, and guiding them to Mount Sinai, where they received the law. And also, too, where they also, in the part of the law, they receive, what is that, Exodus chapters 25 through 40, something like that. Moses received the instructions for the building of the tabernacle. Now, back to my point, because this was not supposed to be a long video, but in the book of Numbers, one of those passages that we see concerning the building of the tabernacle structure was the cloud. And we understand this to be the Shekinah glory cloud, the cloud that God manifested his presence with the Israelites. The cloud would be over the tabernacle. And then when it got time for the Israelites to move, the cloud would indicate when it was time to move. So the cloud would indicate when it would be time for the nation to settle. The cloud would indicate when it would be time for the nation to start off in her journeys and where the nation would journey. So with all of that, let me just read the passage, and then I'll make a few comments about that at the end of it. Anyway, Numbers chapter 9. I'm going to read verses 15 through 23. just going to just read through it, and then we'll make some observations. Now, on the day that the tabernacle was erected, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and in the evening it was like the appearance of fire over the tabernacle until morning. So it was continuously. The cloud would cover it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. Okay, now I know I was supposed to do this, but you know me, guys. But anyway, so notice what we have. We have the presence of the cloud over the tabernacle. Now you have to remember the purpose of the tabernacle. The tabernacle represented the presence of God dwelling amongst the children of Israel. It was the medium and the means by the which God could allow himself to dwell in their presence. Oh my God, I'm not supposed to get into all of these details, but that's why one of the first things that we see in the building of the tabernacle is the altar of burnt offerings. This was the altar that was used for the sacrifice of the animals to deal with the sins. In other words, God could not dwell amongst his people if they were sinful. So therefore, they needed to have a means of allowing God to be able to dwell with them. So their sins had to be dealt with first. Thus, we have the tabernacle in all of its ornate, the way that God told them to build it, with the outer courts, with the altar of burnt offerings to deal with their sins, with the laver that was in the outer court, the washing, and then you have the holy place and the candelabra and the bread, the table of showbread, and even that altar of burnt incense, and then you had the most holy place. But all of this indication of God's dwelling with them. How God is able to dwell. How can they approach God? There must be dealing with their sins, and then God is able to dwell with the people. But going back to these verses, so what do we see? That once the tabernacle was erected, which was about a year later, after them coming out of the land of Egypt, roughly about a year's time later, God manifests that presence no longer. Remember, in Exodus, I think it's like Exodus chapter 13 or 14. It was this cloud that led them coming out of Egypt. Now we see this cloud settling over the tabernacle structure itself, and the evidence that God is present with them. So the cloud manifested itself in a very visibly obvious way over the tabernacle. It was visibly obvious over the tabernacle in the daytime, and visibly obvious over the tabernacle at night as a pillar of fire at night. So if you look toward the tabernacle, you could clearly see something extremely unusual about this particular cloud. It was the strongest indication, without argument, God is present. What? God is present with the people. God is present with the people. God is present over the tabernacle by virtue of this cloud. Now, let's get to the point that I want to make in this whole video. Verse number 17, whenever the cloud was lifted from over the tent. Now pay attention to that. Whenever the cloud was lifted from over the tent, afterward the sons of Israel would then set out. And in the place where the cloud settled down, the sons of Israel would camp. Now this is the principal statement. The principal statement is Israel was led by the cloud. The question, and who was in the cloud? Even from the very beginning in Exodus, as I just made a reference, it was the Lord in the cloud. So the principal statement verse 17 makes is God in the cloud leading them. Verse 18. And note, now here's the point. Here's the point. We got to watch what God does. As a matter of fact, let me just read it and then I'll make a point on that. At the command, P, is actually the word. At the command, which is mouth in Hebrew. But at the command of the Lord, the sons of Israel were set out. You have to feel the gravity of what that verse is saying. Notice the cloud demonstrates the presence of God. The cloud demonstrates by its movement the command of God. So Israel was not just arbitrarily leaving when they wanted to leave, and the cloud was not just arbitrarily going where it wanted to go. It was under the direction of the Lord. And therefore, by the movement of the clouds, it was God speaking to them. Okay, but let me go on because I'm commenting when I should be reading the text. But it is powerful and it is speaking to us in a powerful way. But what does it say? At the command of the Lord, the sons of Israel were set out. At the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud settled over the tabernacle, they remained camped. Now, so that's another principal point. They moved by the cloud. And who was directing the cloud to speak to the children of Israel? Through commandments. This is where you should go. This is when you should encamp. This is the direction you should go. And who is telling them where to go, when to camp, when to move out? God at the command of God. Verse number 19. Watch. Here is the beauty of this part. The minutia, as if it is not clear, as if it's not clear at this point. The cloud is leading them. God is in the cloud, thus God is directing him. The minutia of these next passages is as if it speaks to us like we are children. What do I mean? As if we didn't understand the point that God was trying to make in the first place. We clearly know God in the cloud, God leading them. When he sets down, when the cloud stops moving, God is saying, camp here, camp here. When the cloud gets up from over the tabernacle and starts to get ready to move again, God is saying, all right, pack it up. Let's start on the journey once again. We know that. But notice the beauty of this next part is by repeating it in such a way like we're children and didn't get it. And the question you have to ask yourself, why is God repeating it in this manner, saying to us? Because he is emphasizing, make no misunderstanding. I am directing you. I am directing them. Do you understand? So let me read the verses. 19. Even when the cloud lingered over the tabernacle for many days, the sons of Israel would keep the Lord's charge and not set out. If God stayed over that cloud stayed, you stay, however long it is. If sometimes the cloud remained a few days over the tabernacle, according to the command of the Lord, they remained camped. Then, according to the command of the Lord, they set out. If sometimes the cloud remained from evening even until morning. Now notice that, from evening until just one night. When the cloud was lifted in the morning, they would move out. Or if it remained in the daytime and at night, whenever the cloud was lifted, they would set out. Watch, it keeps going. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a year that the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, staying above it, the sons of Israel remained camped and did not set out. But when it was lifted, they did set out. So notice the minutia of it. But what he's trying to emphasize is clearly who was in charge of where they went, when they went, how long they were encamped, how long they were journeying, whether it was, and it even said overnight, for a day and a night, and they moved the very next day, or even for a day, or even for a month. However it was, the cloud, that is, the Lord who was in the cloud was directing their journey, their stay, and how long they stayed. Now, let me read the final verse so I can make my comments and end the video because it was supposed to be short. At the command of the Lord, they camped. And that's that's the gist of it all. Notice verse number 18. At the command of the Lord, the sons of Israel would set out. And notice how it encapsulates. It's like two pieces of bread, one in the top and then the other at the bottom. And it all has to do with the cloud. At the command of the Lord, they camped. At the command of the Lord, they set out. They kept the Lord's charge according to the command of the Lord through Moses. Moses leading and directing as a whole in the sense of a human figure. But who indeed was in charge to when the Israelites encamped? It was the Lord. The cloud stopped moving and then would settle over the tabernacle. And as long as that cloud was over the tabernacle, Israel was remaining. And thus it was the voice of God himself. That's why they say at the command of the Lord. Actually, I like the Hebrew. The Hebrew says by the moving of the cloud, it was at the mouth of the Lord. So the cloud's position, the cloud's movement was God's commandment to them. And so therefore, if the cloud stayed for a little while, long while, or whatever, the whole point of this is the cloud was the visible manifestation of God's direction for their lives. Let me say that again. The cloud was the visible manifestation for the direction, for the what? The direction of their journeying, Now, why do I say that? Oftentimes we hear a lot of commentators and people say about Israel in that time between coming out of Egypt and going into the promised land that they were wandering in the wilderness. And the sense of wandering means it's like, okay, we don't know where we're going or we're lost and or whatever, we're just kind of bumbling around until finally we get to the determined place where we're supposed to be. I don't like that terminology, wandering in the wilderness. The proper term is their journeys in the wilderness. You see, Israel's journey is to be understood in a sense like the journey of life. But let's bring together the text of what we're talking about. The path that they were led on. Who led them on that path? That's the beautiful thing about the cloud. God was in the cloud. God was directing them. Now, let's give a reflection, because this is one of the very things that Moses said for them to do in the book of Deuteronomy, to think about how God led them. When we read about Israel's journeying, that is Exodus, the book of Exodus, as well as the book of Numbers, we see they would go to certain places where there would be no water. They would come about certain events of time where they would run out of food. They wouldn't have meat to eat, and different places, but especially where they would have not water to eat. And the people would begin to complain and even rebel against Moses. There were certain times when the people would complain and rebel against Moses to the extent they made a determination to choose for themselves new leaders and return back to Egypt. Or even times when Moses would get, can you imagine where the pitch level of the people's rebellion will get so bad where Moses would say to God, these people are about to kill me. And notice, in almost every occasion, notice what the people said to Moses. Why did you, and sometimes they'll even say Aaron, but why did you lead us out of Egypt to these places where there is no food and there is no water? Why did you, Moses, lead us into these places where we and our little ones would die? Why did you do these things? This is a terrible predicament that we're in. We were better off in Egypt. But notice what Numbers teaches us about the cloud. Wherever they went, it was God who led them. It was God who led them when they had no water. It was God who led them when they had no food. And thus Moses said, consider these things. How God led you through these particular places so that you would understand. God used these things to teach them. God used these things. What do I mean? He led them to places when they had no water. Don't you know? And this is the question that is before us. The all-knowing God, when he led them to a place when there was no water, don't you know God who formed the land? He knew there was no water in that place. When they ran out of food, don't you know the God who sees everything knew they had no food? When they had no provisions, don't you think it is God who knew all things? They had no bread to eat. But nevertheless, guess what? When God led them to a place where there was no water, did not God provide the water? When God knew that their food had run out, did not God provide manna from heaven? And when God led them out of Egypt and they had no process of making clothing or manufacturing things for their needs, did not God God did not allow their clothing to wear out? God, who allowed them to walk on their feet in the journey, did not God not allow their feet to swell? God protected them. God provided them. And wherever they were led, it was God who led them. That was the intent of God for their lives. And Moses said, you need to consider that. Why? Because God is trying to teach you, to make you and to fashion you, for you to know and understand. You don't live by what you have in this world. You don't live by bread, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. We live at the command of God. We live by what God says. And it's the same thing even for us today. We need to understand that the cloud of God is on each and every one of our lives. If we belong to God, there is a cloud for us. God has a direction for us. He has a journey for us. He has a path for us to take. And if in the path of life, the journey of life that God leads us on, we come to places where we lack, where we have no water, where we have no food, where we have no provision, when we get sick or tired or whatever the occasion might be, is it not God who is aware? Is it not God who is the sovereign leader in our life? God directs us. Should not we understand? Don't be like the Israelites. Don't murmur and complain. Why? Because wherever God is leading you, that God knows what is best for you. God knows everything about us. That's the whole thing about Israel. Israel thought that they were in pretty good spiritual shape. And you know what God did? He proved that they weren't. Why? God knows the heart of every individual. He knows us all. And therefore, God will lead us into a path sometimes of self-discovery. What do I mean? Sometimes you think you are in good shape about this or that, and God will allow a situation to come up to simply show you you ain't in good a shape as you thought you were. You need spiritual help. And therefore, this forces you to look at yourself, to examine yourself, and then to see that we're not where we need to be, and call upon the Lord. Cry out to God. Say, God, help me. And then we learn to depend on God. We grow in grace. We grow in sanctification. We grow. Sanctification means living a holy life. We grow in trust. We grow in faith. But anyway, so, all right, I'm sorry, I got to preaching, but this is one of the reasons why I like this particular passage. Because it shows that whatever was going on in the journeys of Israel, they weren't wandering in the wilderness. God was leading them, and God led them to particular places of hardships to teach them. It was a father who knew his children even better than they knew themselves. It was a father teaching them, instructing them, and disciplining them so that they could be sons and daughters that he would approve. So the same thing I say to us. Can I say it like the Apostle Paul said it in the book of 1 Thessalonians? In everything, no matter which direction God's cloud leads you in your life, in everything, give thanks. Don't be like the Israelites. Don't murmur and complain. God, I don't have. God, I don't want. God knows you don't have. Well, God, why did you let this? God knows these things. Don't complain. Don't murmur. It's the cloud leading you. It's God leading you. In everything, just give thanks. Why? Because this is God's cloud. This is God's direction. This is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you.